In 1858, Heinrich Barth, a German explorer with a mind as vast as the Sahara itself, embarked on a journey into the heart of one of the most desolate yet magnificent landscapes on Earth, the Sahara Desert. A vast sea of sand, a horizon that stretched forever, hiding its secrets in the folds of time. Barth was driven not by simple curiosity, but by an insatiable desire to uncover the mysteries that had been buried for centuries. His destination was Timbuktu, a city wrapped in the mystique of ancient trade, legends of gold, and a sanctuary of learning that seemed to defy the cruel and barren land that surrounded it. Barth was no ordinary man. He was a scholar in the truest sense of the word. Fluent in Arabic and multiple African languages, he was a bridge between worlds, a man who could converse with the desert's forgotten inhabitants, understand their stories, and capture their essence with the precision of a poet. His journey was more than just an exploration of geography. It was a search for the soul of Africa itself, the echoes of civilizations that had long since crumbled beneath the weight of time and conquest. As Barth followed the Niger River westward, crossing endless stretches of dust and silence, he encountered something even more elusive than the city of Timbuktu. His guides, whispering of forgotten empires and lost cities, told him of Gao, a city once bathed in the grandeur of Songhai, a kingdom that spanned the deserts and savannas, commanding respect from all corners of West Africa. A city that had been the heart of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known, and yet now only the wind knew its name. Imagine the scene: a man of knowledge, a man driven by the weight of history, standing at the edge of a city that had once been a beacon of power, wealth, and culture. Gao, the jewel of Songhai, was waiting to reveal itself, but not in the way Barth had hoped. When Barth first laid eyes upon Gao, it was not the grand architecture, the towering mosques, or the bustling markets that greeted him. No, what he found was a ghost. The remnants of a great city lay scattered across the landscape, crumbling walls, broken towers, and a handful of mud huts that barely whispered the grandeur of the Songhai Empire. What had once been the heartbeat of Africa's greatest empire now stood silent, overtaken by time, neglect, and the inexorable march of nature. Gao was no longer the center of civilization, but a place of desolation. The mosques, which once rang with the prayers of emperors, had crumbled into rubble, their minarets now nothing more than jagged stones protruding from the earth. The people who lived there were few, their lives tied to the land that had once supported the great empire. They were the last remnants of a civilization that had been swallowed by the sands, the blood of the Songhai people now only a distant memory in the air. The desolation of Gao struck Barth deeply. He had come seeking knowledge, hoping to find the soul of the Songhai Empire in the ruins, but what he discovered was a tragedy. The great capital had not been preserved in the sands of time, but ravaged by it. The empire, once a colossus, had crumbled to dust, leaving behind nothing but whispers and shadows. Barth wandered through the ruins, taking careful notes of what remained. He stood at the foot of the ruined tower of the mosque, staring up at the remnants of a once mighty structure. The vegetation had grown thick around the ruins, a rich halo of date palms, tamarind trees, and sycamores. But this beauty seemed to mock the devastation. As he stood in the eerie quiet, Barth wondered, how could a city, a civilization so vast, so rich in history, fall into such ruin? What happened to the greatness that had once flowed through these streets? His mind began to churn with the same questions that would echo through the centuries. Questions that had haunted the explorers before him and would continue to haunt those who came after. How did such an empire rise? And why did it fall? In that moment, Barth wasn't just a scholar. He was a witness, a man standing on the edge of history, staring into the abyss left behind by the Songhai Empire. He saw not just the ruins of a city, but the death of an idea that had once bound together a vast and powerful empire, a people united in conquest, culture, and faith. He felt the weight of its collapse in his very bones. But this wasn't just a story of loss. There was a deeper beauty in the ruins of Gao, a beauty tinged with sadness and reverence. Barth saw it in the land itself. He saw it in the way the earth had swallowed the city, the way the palms and trees had taken root in what had once been the seat of power. It was as though nature had reclaimed what was hers, covering the bones of the empire with a veil of green. And yet, in that very reclamation, there was a quiet dignity, a reminder that nothing, no matter how grand, lasts forever. The story of Gao is the story of all civilizations. It is the story of rise and fall, of ambition and ruin, of glory and obscurity. It is the story of humanity's eternal struggle against time itself. And it is this story that Barth would carry with him as he continued his journey across Africa, searching for the answers that would never come. But his encounter with Gao would not be the last of his reflections on the Songhai Empire. As he pressed on, following the Niger River to its source, Barth found himself haunted by one question. What had caused the fall of this once great empire? How had Songhai, with its immense wealth, its vibrant culture, and its powerful armies, succumbed to the ravages of time? In the end, the answer was as elusive as the empire itself. Some say it was the invasion of foreign armies, like the Moroccan forces that would eventually strike the final blow to the Songhai's already weakened structure. Others claim it was the internal strife, the factions that divided the empire from within, leading to its inevitable collapse. But Barth knew better than to simplify the story. He knew that the rise and fall of empires were never the result of one single cause. They were the product of centuries of history, of choices made and mistakes repeated, of triumphs and failures woven into the very fabric of time. What Barth truly discovered in Gao, in the heart of Songhai's ruins, was not just the story of an empire's demise, but the story of time itself. It was a story of how all things, no matter how powerful, no matter how eternal they seem, eventually fall to the ground, leaving only memories and echoes behind. Welcome to Empires Historical. If you're as captivated by the rise and fall of great civilizations as I am, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support is what keeps us going and brings you more in-depth historical content like this. Join us as we continue to unravel the stories of humanity's greatest empires. Now, imagine that once thriving city, once humming with life, is reduced to whispers carried on the wind. And now, what remains? A desolate land where even the monuments to greatness fade into the horizon. And yet, the story of Songhai continues to live on, in the soil, in the winds, and in the heart of history. As Barth stood amidst the ruins of Gao, he was not just an observer of history. He was a mourner, standing in reverence to a world that had passed into oblivion. The once great city, a place that had resonated with power and prestige, now lay abandoned, its glory reduced to little more than rubble. The wind that swept through the ruins seemed to carry the voices of the past, the ghosts of emperors, warriors, and scholars who had once walked these streets, their footsteps lost to time, their names barely remembered. Barth could almost feel the weight of their dreams, their ambition, their triumphs, and their inevitable decline. The history of Songhai, like the history of all empires, was a story of relentless striving, a story of blood, sweat, and sacrifice to build something grand, something eternal. Yet in the end, it was a story of fragility, of the slow erosion of power, the cracks that appeared under the weight of internal strife, external invasion, and time itself. The Songhai Empire had been a marvel of its time. It was a kingdom that ruled over the vast stretches of West Africa, drawing power from its strategic position along the trans-Saharan trade routes. It was a place where cultures and ideas converged, a hub of trade, knowledge, and influence. The empire had flourished by controlling the resources of the region, gold, salt, and slaves, and by cultivating a vibrant intellectual and spiritual life in its cities. Timbuktu, with its libraries and scholars, had stood as a beacon of knowledge in a world that was just beginning to glimpse the vast potential of learning and civilization. Gao had been its heart, a city built on the dreams of its rulers, who saw themselves not just as kings, but as gods, with the power to shape destiny. But what remained in the wake of all that ambition? What was left of the dreams of those who had once believed they could bend time to their will? Gao was a testament to the impermanence of all things. The earth had swallowed up its grandeur, reclaiming it as nature's own, leaving behind only the bones of a civilization long gone. As Barth pondered these questions, he could not help but feel the enormity of his discovery, not just of an ancient city, but of a profound truth about the fragility of human achievement. The rise of Songhai had been magnificent, but so too was its fall. And in the ruins of Gao, Barth saw the stark reality that no empire, no matter how great, no matter how powerful, was immune to the passage of time. In the desert winds that swept across the land, there was a reminder of the impermanence of all things, a lesson that echoed through the ages. The ruins of Gao were not just the remains of a city. They were the embodiment of a greater truth, the cyclical nature of history. Great civilizations are born. They rise to power, they dominate, and eventually they fall. It is a pattern as old as time itself, and one that no empire, no matter how powerful or invincible, can escape. And yet, there was something deeply humbling about this realization. In the face of such overwhelming evidence of the fragility of human greatness, Barth felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that the story of Songhai, its rise, its fall, and everything in between, was not just a story of loss, but a story of perseverance. For even in its decline, even in the silent ruins of Gao, the legacy of Songhai lived on. It lived on in the memories of the people who had built it, in the stories that would continue to be told about it, and in the lessons that could be drawn from its rise and fall. Barth's journey across Africa had led him to discover the remains of one of history's greatest empires. But it had also led him to discover something even more important: the eternal truth that the greatness of mankind is not measured by the monuments we build, but by the stories we leave behind. And in that, Songhai, though gone, was still very much alive. As Barth packed up his notes and prepared to continue his journey, he felt a deep connection to the past. Gao, though broken and forgotten, had spoken to him in a way that no living city could. It had shown him the power of history, not just as a record of the past, but as a guide for the future. And with that, Barth set off once again, his mind full of questions, but also full of answers. For in the ruins of Gao, he had discovered the essence of history itself, that it is not the cities we build or the empires we create that define us, but the stories we leave behind. The empire may fall, but the story endures. In the vast expanse of West Africa, where the winds of the Sahara meet the fertile banks of the Niger River, the Songhai Empire once stood as a colossus, a testament to the strength, ambition, and vision of the people who built it. It was an empire born from the rivers of trade, and the blood of its warriors, an empire that thrived in the heart of a continent where cultures, religions, and histories converged. The mighty city of Gao, its capital, was not just the political center of this vast kingdom. It was the heartbeat of an empire that spanned thousands of miles, linking the coast of West Africa to the far reaches of the Sahara and beyond. In its prime, Songhai was an empire that glimmered with wealth and influence. From the gold mines of the south to the salt mines of the north, the empire controlled the essential resources that fed the Mediterranean world. It was a kingdom of wealth where merchants traded not just gold, but ideas, philosophies, and faith. The city of Timbuktu, under its reign, was the center of learning and intellectual exchange, its libraries filled with ancient texts that shaped the course of Islamic scholarship. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the sound of merchants haggling in the markets, and the hum of poets and scholars debating under the shade of palm trees. Songhai was built on trade, and its power was rooted in its control of the trans-Saharan trade routes. Caravans of camels laden with salt, gold, and ivory would travel across the desert, connecting Songhai to the great empires of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It was an empire that could command armies and conquer kingdoms, its influence stretching from the heart of West Africa to the edges of the known world. The Songhai Empire was, at one point, the most powerful state in Africa, and it stood proudly as the pinnacle of African civilization. But as with all great empires, its glory was not to last. The empire that had once shaped the course of history began to fracture from within. The foundations that had once been solid, wealth, power, and unity, began to erode, and the cracks began to show. The once loyal subjects of Songhai turned against each other, torn by internal strife, power struggles, and factionalism. The mighty army that had once marched in unison, sweeping across the land, now splintered into factions, each vying for control of the empire. The heart of Songhai, once united, now beat to the rhythm of betrayal and discord. The Songhai Empire, like all great civilizations, fell victim to the same forces that had built it: ambition, greed, and the relentless passage of time. It was not an external force alone that brought the empire to its knees. It was the internal decay, the loss of vision, and the weakening of its once mighty leadership. The empire had grown too large, too unwieldy, and too vulnerable to the forces of both internal and external collapse. At the heart of Songhai's decline was the failure of its leadership. The once great kings, who had led the empire with vision and strength, were replaced by rulers who lacked the wisdom and power to maintain the empire's unity. The royal court, once a center of authority and decision-making, became a battleground for power-hungry princes and ambitious generals. The central authority that had once held the empire together faltered, and the kingdom began to unravel from within. As the political structure of Songhai weakened, its military power also began to decline. The empire had long relied on a strong and disciplined army to protect its borders and maintain its dominance in the region. But as factions fought for control, the military grew divided and ineffective. The once great armies of Songhai, which had conquered vast territories, were now fragmented and disorganized. The strength of the empire's military was no longer enough to protect it from external threats. And then came the invasion. In the late 16th century, as Songhai was teetering on the edge of collapse, the Moroccan forces, armed with gunpowder and firearms, launched a devastating assault on the weakened empire. The Songhai armies, still relying on traditional weapons and tactics, were no match for the firepower of the Moroccan invaders. The empire that had once been the master of the desert now fell before a smaller, more technologically advanced force. The Battle of Tondibi in 1591 marked the final blow to the Songhai Empire, as Moroccan forces crushed the remnants of the Songhai army and seized the capital, Gao. The fall of Songhai was not just a military defeat, it was the end of an era. The once great empire, with its sprawling cities, thriving trade routes, and cultural achievements, was reduced to rubble. The great city of Timbuktu, once a beacon of knowledge, was looted and destroyed. The libraries that had once housed the wisdom of the ages were burned, and the scholars who had made Songhai a center of learning were either killed or scattered to the winds. The soul of the empire was lost, and its legacy faded into obscurity. In the aftermath of the fall of Songhai, the region was plunged into a dark age. The once prosperous cities were abandoned, their markets silent, their streets empty. The great trade routes that had once connected Songhai to the rest of the world were severed, and the empire that had been the center of West Africa's political and cultural life was no more. The people of Songhai, scattered and divided, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. Yet, even in its ruin, the legacy of the Songhai Empire endured. The memory of its power, its wealth, and its culture lived on in the hearts and minds of those who remembered its glory. The ruins of Gao and Timbuktu became symbols of a bygone age, a reminder of what had once been and what could have been. The story of Songhai, like the story of all great empires, was one of rise and fall, of glory and ruin, of the fleeting nature of power and the eternal quest for greatness. The fall of Songhai is a story that echoes through history, a story of ambition, triumph, and ultimately, the inevitable decay that comes with the passage of time. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of all civilizations and of the lessons that can be learned from their rise and fall. The Songhai Empire may have fallen, but its legacy lives on, a testament to the greatness of what was once achieved and a warning of the forces that can bring even the mightiest empires to their knees. The fall of the Songhai Empire was not merely the collapse of a kingdom. It was the collapse of an idea, a civilization, and an era. In the wake of its defeat, what remained was a haunting silence. The bustling markets that had once been filled with the sounds of merchants from all corners of the world were now empty. The grand mosques, with their towering minarets and intricate designs, stood in ruins. The libraries of Timbuktu, where scholars had once gathered to exchange knowledge and ideas, were burned to the ground, their priceless manuscripts lost to the flames of conquest. As the Moroccan invaders took control of the former Songhai heartland, they found not only a kingdom in ruins, but also a cultural and intellectual treasure trove that had been left behind. The legacy of Songhai, though it had been shattered by warfare, could still be felt in the stories of its people and the remnants of its achievements. The empire's role in the trans-Saharan trade, its dominance over vast regions, and its cultural and intellectual contributions continued to resonate, even in the face of its downfall. But the story of Songhai did not end with its military defeat. It became a symbol, not just of the impermanence of empires, but also of the enduring spirit of the people who had built it. The ruins of Gao, though abandoned and forgotten, still spoke to those who had eyes to see. The soil of the empire, rich with the history of its rise and fall, held the memory of a kingdom that had once dominated the heart of West Africa. Even in the midst of destruction, there was a sense of reverence, an acknowledgement of the greatness that had once been, and a reminder that, even in decline, there is value in what was lost. The cultural legacy of the Songhai Empire continued to echo long after its political power had vanished. Despite the invasions, despite the looting, the spirit of Songhai endured in the stories that the people told. They told stories of emperors who had ruled with wisdom and strength, of great military conquests, and of a civilization that had risen to the pinnacle of African achievement. And they told stories of loss, of the fall of an empire that had seemed invincible, of the dreams that had died with it, and of the lessons learned from its collapse. As centuries passed, the remnants of Songhai's glory were scattered across the lands it had once ruled. The traditions of its people were preserved in the oral histories passed down through generations. The gold, salt, and slaves that had once flowed from Songhai into the Mediterranean world were no longer the lifeblood of the empire, but they remained a powerful reminder of the empire's wealth and influence. Even in the face of foreign domination and colonial expansion, the memory of Songhai's greatness would not be erased. Its cultural and intellectual legacy lived on, quietly, in the hearts and minds of those who had inherited its stories. Yet, there was something profoundly tragic about the end of Songhai, a sense of inevitability that seemed to hang over the empire, as though its fall had been written into the very fabric of time. The empire's decline was not caused by a single event or enemy, but by a confluence of factors: internal divisions, political instability, military overextension, and the rise of new forces beyond its borders. These were the same forces that had shaped the rise of great empires in the past and would continue to shape the future of empires yet to come. The lesson of Songhai, then, was not just in its fall, but in the understanding of what made it great in the first place. Its ability to adapt, to unite diverse peoples, to engage with the wider world, and to harness its resources for the benefit of all its people. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Songhai's rise and fall lies in the realization that no empire, no matter how powerful or how wise, can stand forever. Empires are fragile things, built on the dreams and ambitions of men, subject to the whims of time, nature, and fate. The fall of Songhai was a reminder that the greatness of a civilization is not guaranteed, that even the most magnificent empires are vulnerable to the forces that shape the world. In the years following the fall of Songhai, the region would experience profound change. The trans-Saharan trade routes would be severed, and new powers would rise to take the place of the empire. The Moroccan Empire, having conquered Songhai, would expand its influence across the region, but it too would face challenges. The age of empires was drawing to a close, and a new world, one defined by European colonialism and global trade, was beginning to take shape. Yet, despite the passing of the Songhai Empire, the lessons of its rise and fall endured. The legacy of Songhai, both in terms of its cultural contributions and its downfall, continued to resonate throughout West Africa. The people of the region, though scattered and divided, would draw upon the memory of Songhai to inspire their future endeavors. They would remember the power of unity, the importance of trade, and the value of knowledge. And they would remember the price of complacency, of failing to recognize the forces that threatened to tear down the walls of empire. The fall of Songhai, in the end, was not just the fall of an empire. It was the fall of an idea, a dream that had lived on for centuries. But even in its ruin, Songhai's legacy lived on, woven into the fabric of history, a symbol of both the triumphs and tragedies of human ambition. And in that legacy, there was a quiet, powerful lesson that all things, no matter how mighty, must eventually fade. But the story they leave behind, the lessons they teach, can endure for generations to come. The story of Songhai is a story of empires, yes, but more than that, it is the story of humanity itself. A story of ambition, of greatness, of failure, and of the lessons we learn from both. In the ruins of Songhai, we see the eternal struggle of civilization against time, a struggle that continues to this day as empires rise and fall, and as we too continue to write our own stories into the annals of history. In the great sweep of history, the rise and fall of empires is a cycle as old as time itself. It is a cycle written in the blood of conquerors, in the sweat of laborers, and in the aspirations of those who dreamt of immortality through the construction of greatness. For every empire that has carved its name into the annals of time, there has been a pattern, a trajectory that leads from the height of power and prosperity to the depths of decay and ultimately to collapse. This cycle, relentless and inevitable, is the fate that awaits even the mightiest of civilizations. The Songhai Empire, once a towering colossus in the heart of West Africa, was no exception. Its rise mirrored that of the empires before it, Ghana, Mali, and others, all of which followed a remarkably similar pattern. First, there was the period of consolidation, the drawing together of resources, of men, and of minds. The rivers of trade flowed, bringing gold, salt, and ideas into the empire's veins, enriching its cities, strengthening its armies, and fostering a culture that was both vibrant and awe-inspiring. But as the centuries wore on, something changed. The once shining cities began to show cracks. The unity that had held the empire together began to fracture, and the forces that had once been controlled began to spin beyond the grasp of those who once ruled. The fall of Songhai, then, was not an isolated tragedy. It was the culmination of a story that had played out countless times across the globe. A story as old as the rise of civilization itself. The inevitable unraveling of the powerful, the fracturing of unity, and the opening of the door to outside forces that would, like vultures, swoop down on the weakened prey. At the height of its power, the Songhai Empire stretched across the Sahel from the shores of the Niger River to the vast reaches of the Sahara Desert. It was an empire that had been built on the back of trade, on the exchange of gold and salt, and on the intellectual riches of cities like Timbuktu, where scholars from across the Muslim world gathered to exchange knowledge. Its power was unchallenged, its influence sweeping, and its wealth legendary. But just as the rise of Songhai had been forged in the crucible of ambition and opportunity, so too would its fall be shaped by those very same forces. As with all great empires, the seeds of Songhai's decline were sown in its greatest strengths. The wealth that had made it prosperous became a double-edged sword. It attracted traders, merchants, and adventurers, but it also drew the envy and greed of external powers. Morocco, a rising force to the north, saw the riches of Songhai as a prize to be claimed. As the Songhai Empire grew, so too did its vulnerability to outside aggression. The great trade routes that had brought prosperity now made Songhai an attractive target for invaders. For an empire that had risen through the strength of its economy and military prowess, the arrival of foreign powers would prove to be its undoing. Internally, the empire was already beginning to fray at the edges. The once strong leadership that had unified the disparate tribes and regions of Songhai began to falter. The vision that had once guided the empire was lost in a haze of factionalism and personal ambition. The military, once the most disciplined and formidable in the region, became divided. Power struggles within the royal court weakened the central authority, and the unity that had been the hallmark of Songhai began to dissolve. And then came the invasion. Morocco, with its new military technology, gunpowder, and firearms, began to encroach upon Songhai. The Songhai forces, still relying on traditional weapons and tactics, were no match for the Moroccan invaders. It was the perfect storm of internal discord and external threat, and it culminated in the Battle of Tondibi in 1591. The Moroccans, with their superior weaponry, crushed the Songhai army, marking the beginning of the end for the once great empire. But the fall of Songhai was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era, a symbolic collapse of a way of life that had shaped the region for centuries. the great city of Gao. The heart of Songhai was overrun, its markets silenced, its mosques reduced to rubble. The intellectual beacon that had been Timbuktu was looted and destroyed, its libraries of ancient wisdom burned to the ground. The spirit of the empire, once vibrant and unstoppable, now lay in tatters, and the people who had once flourished under its rule were left scattered and vulnerable, their world torn apart by the forces of time and war. The cycle of rise and fall that had defined so many empires before Songhai had come full circle. What had once been a beacon of power and culture now lay in ruin. The Songhai Empire had followed the same tragic path that so many before it had walked, from strength to weakness, from unity to division, from prosperity to ruin. The collapse of Songhai was a harbinger of what was to come for all empires. History is littered with the remains of great civilizations that once seemed invincible. From the Roman Empire to the Mongol Khans, from the Aztecs to the British Empire, all have risen to greatness and fallen to dust. The story of Songhai is no different. It is a microcosm of the broader historical arc that all empires follow. There is a universal truth embedded in these cycles. Empires are born of ambition, rise on the strength of their people, and fall when the unity and vision that created them are lost. No empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the relentless march of time and change. In the case of Songhai, the fragmentation of power, the loss of strong leadership, and the encroachment of external forces combine to seal its fate. Yet the lessons of its rise and fall are not lost in the sands of time. They echo through history, reminding us that greatness is fleeting, that power is fragile, and that the rise of empires is always followed by their inevitable decline. But even in its destruction, Songhai's legacy endured. It is a testament to the resilience of human civilization, that even in the face of collapse, the story of what came before lives on. The ruins of Gao and Timbuktu, the remnants of Songhai's glory, remain a symbol not only of what was lost, but of what can be learned from the cycle of empire. Songhai's fall, like that of all empires, marks the closing of one chapter in the book of history and the opening of another. And as we look to the future, we must remember that we, too, are writing our own story, one that will, in time, become another chapter in the eternal cycle of rise and fall. The story of Songhai, like the story of all great civilizations, will continue to shape our understanding of power, ambition, and the cost of greatness. The cycle of empire, as old as humanity itself, will continue to turn, forever shaping the course of history. As the Songhai Empire lay in ruins, a final sorrowful truth hung over its desolate lands. Nothing lasts forever. Its fall was a testament to the fragility of human endeavor, the impermanence of even the grandest civilizations. The once great empire had risen from the dust, driven by ambition, vision, and the drive to create something everlasting. Yet, in the end, it fell like so many before it, consumed by the very forces that had once made it powerful. What remained of Songhai was a broken kingdom, a fading memory of what had been, its glory only whispered by the winds that swept through the empty streets of its former capitals. The fall of Songhai, however, is not just a story of defeat, but also one of enduring lessons that transcend the borders of the empire and reach across the ages, reminding future generations of the nature of power, the limits of ambition, and the value of unity. The empire's demise was not a sudden event, nor was it the result of a single cause. It was the culmination of many factors: internal strife, external invasion, and the relentless passing of time. It was the unraveling of a great civilization brought about by its own internal divisions, its failure to adapt to changing circumstances, and the unchecked greed of those who sought to seize control. The cycle of empires, which had played out so many times before, had claimed another victim. Yet, the lessons of Songhai's rise and fall continue to resonate, offering a powerful reminder of the forces that shape the world. In the aftermath of Songhai's collapse, the region was forever changed. The vast trade networks that had once connected the empire to the Mediterranean world, to Europe and the Middle East, were severed. The great caravan routes that had carried gold, salt, and ivory across the desert now stood silent, their paths forgotten by all but the few who still remembered the old ways. The cultural and intellectual life that had flourished in the empire's cities was extinguished, leaving behind only the faintest traces of the glory that had once been. Yet even in the face of such destruction, Songhai's legacy endured. It lived on in the memories of its people, in the oral histories that passed from generation to generation, and in the stories of the empire's rise, its greatness, and its ultimate fall. But the cycle of empires is never truly complete. As one empire falls, another rises to take its place. The world of Songhai did not disappear. It simply transformed. The rise of Morocco, its eventual domination of the region, and the coming of European colonial powers all marked the beginning of a new chapter in West Africa's history. The forces that had contributed to Songhai's decline, the expansion of foreign empires, the rise of new technologies and strategies of warfare, would continue to shape the future of the continent. And yet, even in the face of foreign domination, the memory of Songhai lived on. The people of the region, who had once thrived under its rule, would continue to draw upon the legacy of their past. The stories of the great emperors of Songhai, their military conquests, their cultural achievements, and their intellectual contributions would not be forgotten. In the face of colonialism, the pride of the people would endure, and the values of unity, strength, and resilience would continue to inspire those who sought to rebuild from the ashes of empire. The fall of Songhai is a reminder that all empires, no matter how great, are subject to the whims of time, nature, and fate. It is a lesson in the fragility of power, the cost of ambition, and the inevitability of change. And yet, it is also a story of human resilience, of the ability to rise again from the ashes, to learn from the past, and to carry forward the lessons of history. The story of Songhai is not just a story of decline, but of survival, of endurance, and of the eternal quest for greatness. In the end, the fall of Songhai serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, that the empires we build today will one day be replaced by the empires of tomorrow. But it also teaches us that, even in the face of ruin, there is something to be learned, something to be gained. The story of Songhai is not just a story of loss, but of what is gained through the struggle, through the rise and fall of empires. It is a story that continues to shape our understanding of history, of power, and of the enduring spirit of humanity. The cycle may turn, and empires may rise and fall, but the story of Songhai, like the stories of all great civilizations, will endure. In the vast, undulating desert of the Sahara, where the golden sands stretch beyond the horizon, there lay an intricate web of trade routes that connected the civilizations of West Africa with the distant lands of North Africa and beyond. These routes, carved through the very heart of the desert, were not merely paths to transport goods. They were the lifeblood of empires, the veins through which the prosperity of nations flowed. And in this vast network of commerce, the Songhai Empire stood as a monumental force, a kingdom shaped by the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. an empire whose destiny was intertwined with the riches carried on the backs of camels and the whispers of traders. Trade was not just the foundation of Songhai's economy, it was the very essence of its existence. The empire was built upon the exchange of salt, as gold, ivory, and enslaved people, commodities that were as much symbols of wealth as they were of the empire's reach. From the southern regions rich with gold to the northern realms where salt was worth its weight in gold, Songhai flourished as the central hub of this vast commercial network. The rivers of trade that flowed through it were like the lifeblood of an ancient and powerful being, sustaining its growth, feeding its people, and connecting it to the rest of the world. But within the veins of this great empire also lay the seeds of its downfall, for trade, like all powerful forces, can be both a blessing and a curse. At the heart of this empire stood the two great cities of Gao and Timbuktu. Gao, the imperial capital, was not merely the political center of Songhai. It was the place where the wealth of the empire flowed like a river. Markets thrived under the watchful gaze of grand mosques, their minarets rising into the sky like towering beacons of prosperity. Merchants from across Africa and beyond came to barter their goods, and in these bustling streets, wealth and power were on full display. Yet it was Timbuktu that truly embodied the soul of the empire, for it was here that the treasures of knowledge and culture were exchanged with as much fervor as gold and salt. The great libraries of Timbuktu held scrolls and manuscripts that chronicled the wisdom of the ages, while scholars from across the Muslim world came to engage in the pursuit of knowledge. It was a city of learning and thought, a place where the future of Songhai was not only shaped by the wealth of its trade, but by the intellectual wealth of its people. Timbuktu, with its deep connection to both the Islamic world and the indigenous cultures of West Africa, was more than just a trading post. It was a symbol of the cultural and intellectual flourishing that Songhai represented. Here, the exchange of ideas was as vital as the exchange of commodities. Poets, philosophers, and scientists gathered in the city's grand courtyards to debate and share knowledge, creating an intellectual melting pot where the ancient world's wisdom met the vibrant and diverse cultures of Africa. The city stood as a testament to the power of trade, for it was through these exchanges that Songhai had risen to prominence, not just through the wealth of its resources, but through the richness of its intellectual life. But trade, like all great forces of nature, is a double-edged sword. While it brought riches, it also brought vulnerabilities. The wealth that flowed through Songhai made it a magnet for the avarice of foreign powers. The same trade routes that connected it to the Mediterranean world and the Middle East now exposed it to the ambition of outside forces. The mighty kingdom of Morocco to the north, with its newly acquired military technology, the gunpowder and firearms that could alter the course of history, looked southward, coveting the wealth of Songhai. The trade that had once been a source of prosperity now became a potential source of conflict, as Morocco sought to seize control of the very roots that had once fueled Songhai's dominance. The power of commerce was not merely a material force. It was a force that shaped the very identity of the empire. The Songhai Empire had risen to greatness through its ability to control and direct the flow of goods across Africa. Its wealth was not simply the product of natural resources, but of the networks of trade it had established, networks that reached from the gold mines of the south to the salt flats of the north. These trade routes were the veins through which the empire's wealth flowed, connecting it to distant lands and ensuring its place as one of the most powerful states in Africa. But with power came fragility, and as the empire's control of these trade routes weakened, so too did the strength of Songhai itself. As the empire began to crumble from within, the very trade routes that had once sustained it began to fray. The stability that trade had once provided gave way to instability, as conflict, both internal and external, disrupted the flow of goods. The once bustling markets of Gao fell silent, and the libraries of Timbuktu, once filled with the whispers of scholars, began to fade into the silence of history. The decline of Songhai's commercial prowess mirrored the empire's internal disintegration as the once thriving trade networks that had made it great began to wither. The trade that had brought wealth now brought ruin, for as foreign invasions disrupted the supply lines and internal divisions weakened the empire's grip on power, the lifeblood of Songhai drained away. Yet even in the ruins, the legacy of Songhai's trade empire endured. Though the great markets of Gao fell silent and the intellectual brilliance of Timbuktu was silenced, the memory of what once was remained. The stories of the great trade routes, of the caravans that crossed the Sahara laden with treasures, lived on in the hearts of those who had once thrived under the empire's rule. The legacy of Songhai's commerce was not just one of wealth, but one of cultural exchange and intellectual growth. A legacy that, though shattered, still resonated in the stories passed down through the generations. The fall of Songhai is a reminder of the power of commerce, but also of its fragility. Trade can build empires, but it can also tear them apart. The rise and fall of Songhai illustrates not only the economic forces that shape the world, but also the cultural and intellectual forces that determine the legacy of a civilization. Songhai's commercial success was the key to its greatness, but it was also the very thing that made it vulnerable. The empire's story is a cautionary tale about the balance between power and fragility, and the delicate line between prosperity and decline. As the sands of time shift and the winds of change blow across the desert, the legacy of Songhai's trade empire stands as both a testament to what was achieved and a reminder of what can be lost when the forces of ambition and greed overtake the forces of unity and foresight. In the end, the story of Songhai's trade empire is not just one of rise and fall, but of the enduring impact of commerce on civilization. It is a story of connections, of cultures intertwined, of wealth and ideas exchanged. And as the winds of history continue to blow, the memory of those ancient trade routes, of the bustling markets and the libraries of Timbuktu, will continue to echo across the vast expanse of time, a silent reminder of the power of trade to shape the world, for better or for worse. As the final whispers of Songhai's great commercial empire faded into the wind, the remnants of its once thriving cities stood as monuments to what had been and what might have been. The once vibrant streets of Gao, where merchants from all corners of the world once gathered, now lay silent, echoing only the faintest reminders of the wealth and power that had passed through them. The grand mosques and the intellectual heart of Timbuktu, whose libraries had once held the collective wisdom of the ages, now lay empty, their pages consumed by flames, and their manuscripts scattered like dust on the desert wind. But even in this desolation, the legacy of trade endured, not in the physical remnants of the empire, but in the invisible threads that connected the world through commerce, culture, and knowledge. The trade routes that had once linked Songhai to the Mediterranean, to the markets of the Middle East, and to the far-flung corners of Africa may have fallen into disrepair, but the connections they fostered continued to shape the world. From the desert caravans that had carried salt, gold, and ivory, to the scholars who had gathered in Timbuktu to exchange ideas and philosophies, the Songhai Empire had been a vital part of a larger, interconnected world, where the flow of goods was as essential as the flow of knowledge. Though the empire had crumbled, its influence could still be seen in the people who carried its stories forward, in the traders who, despite the loss of a central empire, continued to traverse the desert, bearing the memory of Songhai's golden age. The intellectual legacy of Timbuktu, while dimmed by the flames of conquest, continued to inspire those who sought knowledge in the farthest corners of Africa. The empire's influence, though no longer centralized, persisted through the dissemination of ideas, the sharing of cultural practices, and the continued exchange of goods that transcended borders. The fall of Songhai's trade empire is also a powerful reminder of the complexity and fragility of global trade systems. Trade, like empires themselves, is a fragile network of interdependencies, vulnerable to the forces of time, conflict, and change. The empire's rise had been driven by the strength of its control over trade, yet its downfall was equally linked to the very forces of commerce that had once made it great. External invasions, internal conflict, and the sheer weight of time took their toll on the once mighty trade routes, causing them to wither and collapse under the pressure. Yet, even as the physical infrastructure of trade began to crumble, the spirit of commerce did not vanish entirely. The merchants and traders of Songhai, who had once thrived under the empire's banner, were not extinguished by its fall. They too adapted, finding new routes, new markets, and new ways to continue their work. In this way, the legacy of Songhai's trade empire continued to live on, not just in the grand cities of the past, but in the people who had built and sustained those cities through their work and their dreams. In this sense, the collapse of Songhai was not the death of its commercial spirit. It was simply a transition from an empire-based system of trade to a more fragmented yet still vibrant system of exchanges. The ruins of Gao and Timbuktu were not just empty shells of a lost empire. They were the symbols of a new chapter, one in which trade, ideas, and culture would continue to flow, albeit in different forms. The desert caravans may no longer have been able to carry the weight of an empire, but they still carried the essence of what had made Songhai great. The drive for connection, the thirst for knowledge, and the enduring belief that trade is not just the exchange of goods, but the exchange of humanity itself. In the end, the story of Songhai's commercial empire is a story of both loss and transformation. It reminds us that while empires may fall, the forces that shape them, commerce, culture, and the human desire for connection, do not die with them. Instead, they persist, weaving through the fabric of history, influencing the world in ways both seen and unseen. The legacy of Songhai, like the winds that blew across the Sahara, may have faded from the world's attention, but its impact continues to ripple through time, leaving traces in the stories we tell, the trade we engage in, and the ideas we continue to share across the globe. In the depths of the vast Sahara, where the desert winds sweep across the barren landscape and the distant echoes of history whisper through the dunes, the Songhai Empire once stood as a beacon of power, wealth, and culture. Yet beneath this grandeur, within the veins of its flourishing society, there ran an undercurrent of darkness, a stain upon its legacy that shaped its economy and its very foundation. This darkness, this scourge, was the institution of slavery. Slavery was not an isolated phenomenon in the history of Songhai. It was woven into the fabric of the empire from its earliest days, as it was in many great civilizations that arose across Africa and beyond. It was the price that was paid for the empire's wealth and prosperity. The vast trade networks that crossed the desert and connected Songhai to the Mediterranean world were not just conduits for gold, salt, and ivory. They were the very lifelines of the slave trade. People, captured in wars or sold by their own communities, were shackled, branded, and sent across the desert to become property, to toil in fields, to serve in households, to be sold in distant markets. The very foundations of Songhai's wealth and military strength were built, in part, upon the blood of those who had no voice in the empire's fortunes. But as the Songhai Empire rose to its peak, its reliance on the enslaved was more than just an economic strategy. It was a symbol of the empire's contradictions. The same empire that fostered great intellectual achievements, that cultivated centers of learning like Timbuktu, was also built on the backs of those who had no freedom, no rights. Scholars and traders exchanged knowledge and goods, but the lives of the enslaved were little more than commodities in this great exchange. And so, the greatness of Songhai was stained, not just by the presence of slavery, but by the way it became entangled with the very core of what the empire had built. The impact of slavery was felt in every corner of Songhai society. It permeated its cities, its markets, its palaces, and even its military. It was there in the fields, where enslaved men and women labored tirelessly to produce the food that fed the empire's armies and people. It was there in the homes, where they served as cooks, servants, and concubines, the invisible hands that allowed the elite of Songhai to live in comfort, while others suffered in silence. It was in the barracks, where enslaved individuals were sometimes pressed into service as soldiers, conscripted into the wars that would eventually lead to the empire's destruction. In this way, the enslaved were both the foundation and the fuel that sustained the empire's power, yet they were also its silent, unseen victims. As the Songhai Empire began to show signs of decline, slavery's role in the empire became even more pronounced. The loss of vital human resources, once captured through raids and wars, began to undermine the very infrastructure of the empire. The rebellion of enslaved peoples, the flight of those who escaped to seek freedom, and the weakening of trade routes due to the disruption of war and external invasions were all symptoms of the greater unraveling of Songhai. The economy, once so dependent on slavery, faltered as the labor force diminished and the military power of the empire weakened. The plight of the enslaved grew even more dire as the empire's internal divisions deepened. The political instability that accompanied the decay of Songhai's leadership left the empire vulnerable to foreign invasions, particularly from the rising Moroccan forces in the north. The economic infrastructure, propped up by the trade of slaves, gold, and salt, began to crumble under the weight of external threats and internal strife. As the empire splintered, so too did the conditions for the enslaved worsen. Those who had once been integral to Songhai's success were now cast aside, their fates entwined with the very downfall of the empire. Yet, even as the empire crumbled, the legacy of slavery did not simply disappear. It left its mark not only on the people of Songhai, but also on the entire region of West Africa. The slave trade, which had long been an integral part of the Songhai economy, continued to reverberate through the centuries. Even as the Songhai Empire fell to the Moroccan invasion, the trade in enslaved people would only grow, not just through the Sahara, but also across the Atlantic. The legacy of Songhai's involvement in the slave trade would become part of the broader tragedy of African enslavement, stretching across the world and echoing through history. And so, the tragedy of the enslaved people of Songhai was not merely the loss of their freedom, their dignity, or their humanity. It was also the collapse of a way of life that had thrived on their suffering. As the empire's power waned, so too did the power of those who had benefited from it. The rulers of Songhai, the great kings and military leaders, watched as their empire crumbled around them. But even as they fell, they too were unable to escape the consequences of their reliance on a system built on the backs of the enslaved. In the end, the downfall of Songhai was as much a reflection of the injustice of slavery as it was the decay of a once great empire. The loss of a labor force, the fracturing of a society built on exploitation, and the collapse of a system that had valued gold over humanity were all part of the same tragic arc. As the empire fell, so too did the veil that had once concealed the true cost of its power. The legacy of slavery, intertwined with the rise and fall of Songhai, is a reminder that no empire, no matter how great, can withstand the forces of injustice and inequality forever. The enslaved people of Songhai, though forgotten by many, played an integral role in the shaping of the empire. Their suffering, their labor, their lives were the unseen foundation of Songhai's power. And when the empire crumbled, it was their absence that left a void too deep to fill. For all the glory and grandeur of Songhai's rise, it was the pain and loss of the enslaved that remains as one of its most enduring legacies. As the dust of Songhai's grandeur settled and the empire fell into ruin, the lingering shadows of slavery remained long after the final echoes of its power had faded into the winds of history. The enslaved peoples, once the invisible backbone of the empire, left an indelible imprint on the landscape of West Africa, a reminder of the profound impact of exploitation on the soul of a civilization. Their legacy, though buried beneath the sands of time, continues to reverberate in the echoes of the past. The role of slavery in the Songhai Empire was more than just an economic necessity. It was deeply ingrained in the fabric of its social structure. In Songhai, slavery was not confined to the margins of society, but was intertwined with the empire's very core. Those who were captured in wars, raided from neighboring tribes, or born into servitude were viewed not as people, but as property. The people of Songhai, who once walked through their cities with pride, would find themselves sold and traded like cattle. Families were torn apart, lives shattered, and dreams crushed under the weight of an institution that robbed individuals of their humanity. But what was perhaps most tragic about the role of slavery in Songhai was the way in which it was woven into the very idea of empire. The vast wealth of Songhai, its military prowess, and its intellectual achievements were all built on the suffering of the enslaved. The wealth that poured into Songhai through its trade routes, gold, salt, and ivory, was made possible in part by the labor of those who had no choice but to toil in the fields, in the homes of the elite, and in the barracks of the military. They were the unseen workers, the silent forces that propelled Songhai to its peak, yet they were denied the dignity and respect that came with that very success. As the empire began to falter, the reliance on slavery became a double-edged sword. The political instability and internal strife that weakened Songhai also affected the system of slavery. With the weakening of the empire's leadership, the central authority began to crumble, and with it, the social order that had relied on the subjugation of others. The enslaved peoples, once considered property, began to resist their fate. They ran, they fought back, they escaped to the fringes of society, seeking freedom in a land that had once offered them none. The decline of Songhai itself mirrored the erosion of its slave economy. The collapse of the empire's trade routes, the invasion from Morocco, and the weakening of the military all contributed to the breakdown of the infrastructure that had once supported the system of slavery. As the empire lost its grip on power, the flow of slaves into and out of the region slowed. The great cities of Gao and Timbuktu, once thriving hubs of commerce and learning, now lay in ruins. The libraries that once held the wisdom of generations were burned. The streets, once bustling with merchants, now silent. But in the absence of these symbols of power, the enslaved populations, scattered and broken, found their own way to survive. Even in the face of destruction, the spirit of the enslaved peoples endured. Their stories, passed down through oral traditions, continued to echo through the generations long after the empire that had enslaved them was gone. The memories of those who had been sold, forced into labor, or captured in war lived on in the hearts of their descendants. The pain and suffering endured by the enslaved in Songhai became part of the collective memory of West Africa, a cautionary tale of the dangers of inequality, exploitation, and the brutal nature of empire. As the remnants of Songhai's glory faded into the past, the legacy of slavery did not disappear. It transformed, evolved, and persisted. The brutal system of slavery that had flourished within the empire continued to fuel the transatlantic slave trade, a trade that would continue to devastate the African continent for centuries to come. The enslaved peoples, who had once been bound by the borders of Songhai, were now dispersed across the globe. Their labor, their bodies, and their lives were sold to the highest bidder, fueling the economies of Europe and the Americas, while leaving Africa forever scarred by the legacy of human trafficking. The decline of Songhai and its reliance on slavery, however, also brought about a profound shift in the region. As the empire collapsed, new powers began to rise from its ashes. The once powerful kingdom of Songhai was replaced by the new kingdoms and empires that took shape in the wake of its destruction. Some of these new states were founded on different principles, attempting to escape the social injustices and internal strife that had led to Songhai's downfall. The slave trade, while still rampant in the region, began to take on a new form. Instead of being an internal institution, it was now propelled by external forces, with European powers playing a dominant role in the trade. The aftermath of Songhai's collapse was not just a political void. It was a social vacuum, one that left the enslaved peoples to continue their struggle for survival. They were no longer just a part of the economic machinery of the empire, but a people who had been fragmented by war, conquest, and the greed of the powerful. Yet, through it all, they remained resilient. The legacy of the enslaved peoples of Songhai lived on in the cultural, social, and political changes that followed the empire's fall. Their songs, their stories, their culture, and their resilience were woven into the fabric of West African society. Even as they endured unimaginable hardships, they held on to the remnants of their identity. From the ashes of Songhai, the spirit of the enslaved people would live on, carried forward by the generations that followed. It would not be a legacy of submission or subjugation, but one of resistance, survival, and ultimately, triumph. The impact of slavery in the Songhai Empire serves as a somber reminder of the costs of empire building and the lengths to which human ambition can go in the pursuit of power and wealth. It teaches us that the strength of a civilization is not just measured by its wealth, its military might, or its intellectual achievements, but by the treatment of its most vulnerable. The story of the enslaved peoples of Songhai is not just the story of their suffering, but also a testament to their endurance, their strength, and their refusal to be forgotten. Even as the empire crumbled, the enslaved peoples of Songhai continued to shape the future of the region. Their legacy would live on, not just in the memories of those who had known them, but in the societies they helped build and the cultures they enriched. It is a legacy that endures through the centuries, reminding us that while empires may fall, the spirit of those who built them, both enslaved and free, endures for generations to come. In the closing years of the 16th century, as the last embers of the Songhai Empire flickered in the winds of time, a storm from the north came to extinguish the flame. Morocco, a rising power with a military might unmatched by the crumbling forces of Songhai, set its sights on the wealth and power that once defined the great empire. Armed with the devastating weaponry of the age, guns, cannons, and the relentless resolve of its soldiers, Morocco's invasion would prove to be the final blow to a civilization already weakened by internal strife, corruption, and decay. The Songhai Empire, once an unshakable titan of West Africa, was now crumbling beneath its own weight. The once glorious city of Gao, the heart of Songhai, was now vulnerable. It stood as a monument to a fading age, its grand buildings and markets now shadowed by the advancing Moroccan forces. Timbuktu, too, the fabled center of learning and culture, would fall. These cities, the pride of Songhai, would surrender to the superior firepower and strategy of the Moroccan invaders. The rich heritage, the wealth of knowledge, the shimmering golden sands of Songhai's once unmatched prosperity, all these would be consumed by the flames of foreign conquest. But Morocco's invasion was not just an isolated event. It was the first of many foreign interferences that would eventually reshape the entire region. The downfall of Songhai marked the beginning of a new chapter, one written by the hands of external forces. Forces that would come not just with armies, but with an insatiable hunger for control over the wealth and resources of West Africa. As Morocco asserted its power over Songhai, it did not merely conquer land. It marked the beginning of a far-reaching geopolitical shift. The invaders sought to control the vital trans-Saharan trade routes, which had long sustained the empire's wealth. These routes, once conduits for the flow of gold, salt, and slaves, became the battleground for imperial ambitions. Morocco's military victory was more than a conquest of land. It was a seizure of destiny itself. And in this moment, Songhai's once proud legacy began to fade beneath the weight of foreign intervention. Yet Morocco was not alone in its ambitions. The European powers, driven by their own lust for wealth and resources, also began to turn their eyes toward West Africa. Portugal, Spain, and later, Britain and France all sought to expand their influence, particularly in the realms of trade and colonization. The vast wealth that had once flowed from Songhai's hands was now the prize of new invaders, this time from the seas. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Portugal had already begun establishing trading posts along the West African coast, and soon other European powers followed suit. Their involvement in the region was not merely one of peaceful commerce. The European powers, like the Moroccans, sought control over the most valuable resources: gold, ivory, and slaves. The riches of West Africa were to fuel the burgeoning economies of Europe, and the African continent became a key player in the expanding global trade networks. The intervention of the European powers in West Africa forever altered the region's history. Whereas Songhai had once controlled its own destiny, now foreign empires sought to dictate its future. The Portuguese established forts and trading posts along the coast, which soon became the centers of European dominance in the region. But their goals were not just limited to trade. They sought to monopolize the flow of African resources, and in doing so, they helped lay the groundwork for the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. West Africa, once a center of civilization, became a pawn in the European race for global dominance. As Morocco and the European powers pressed forward with their designs, the traditional powers of West Africa, including what remained of Songhai, found themselves caught in a maelstrom of foreign interests. The imperial ambitions of the North and the West intersected with the fading dreams of the Songhai Empire, and the people who had once thrived under Songhai's rule now found themselves trapped between warring foreign powers, stripped of their sovereignty, and left vulnerable to exploitation. This was the tragic turning point in the history of West Africa, a moment when external forces, driven by greed and the thirst for control, began to reshape the continent. The legacy of Songhai, once so resplendent with cultural wealth, knowledge, and military might, was now fragmented, and the region's future was being determined not by its own people, but by distant powers whose interests lay in profit, not in progress. The consequences of this intervention were far-reaching. With the rise of European colonial powers, the region became an arena for international conflict and exploitation. The once thriving trade routes of Songhai were repurposed to serve the interests of European colonizers, and the cities that had once been centers of culture and learning were now reduced to outposts for the colonial enterprise. The people of West Africa, caught in the web of foreign imperialism, found their lands divided, their cultures under threat, and their resources drained by the unrelenting forces of empire. In the wake of the Moroccan invasion, and with the increasing involvement of European powers, the region entered an era of deep change. The rise of the slave trade, fueled by European demand for labor in the Americas, would forever alter the social fabric of West Africa. The legacy of Songhai, though shattered by foreign conquest, lived on in the stories and struggles of its people. But it was now a world where the drumbeats of war and the clamor of imperial ambition drowned out the wisdom of the past. The intervention of external empires, the Moroccans from the north and the European colonizers from the sea, marked the end of an era for West Africa. It was a time when the dream of independence and unity that had once fueled the rise of Songhai was crushed beneath the boots of foreign invaders. The region was no longer a bastion of self-determination, but a pawn in the hands of global empires, each vying for control over the riches of Africa. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, even in the shadow of imperial conquest, the spirit of the people of West Africa endured. The people who had once been the heart of the Songhai Empire, who had cultivated the land, who had built the cities, who had created the wealth, those people lived on. Their descendants would carry forward the memory of Songhai's glory, even as the region descended into an era of foreign domination and colonial rule. In the end, the intervention of Morocco and the European powers marked a new chapter for the region, one that would unfold over the next several centuries. The story of Songhai was but one part of a greater narrative, a story that continues to shape the history of West Africa to this day. From the ashes of empire, new powers would rise, but the legacy of Songhai's glory, its wealth, and its tragic fall would never be forgotten. And the spirit of the people of Songhai would live on, etched into the very soul of Africa, forever a part of its enduring story. As the Songhai Empire fell and foreign powers tightened their grip over the region, a new chapter in West Africa's history began to unfold, one that would be shaped by the forces of imperialism and colonial expansion. While the winds of change swept across the continent, the memory of Songhai's greatness lingered, not just in the ruins of its cities, but in the hearts and minds of its people. The spirit of Songhai, though fractured by the forces of war and conquest, would persist through generations, fueling the resilience and endurance of those who would later rise against the forces that sought to dominate Africa. The intervention of Morocco and the European colonial powers was not merely a political and military conquest, but a profound cultural and social upheaval that would reshape the fabric of West Africa. The conquest by foreign powers, driven by greed and a hunger for resources, disrupted the traditional power structures that had long governed the region. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had once been the lifeblood of the Songhai Empire were repurposed to serve the needs of distant empires, and the rich cultural exchange that had once flowed between Timbuktu and the broader Islamic world was stifled. The European powers, in particular, brought with them not just guns and cannons, but ideologies that would forever alter the course of African history. The concept of race, as it was developed and institutionalized in the context of European colonialism, began to take root in West Africa. The indigenous people who had once ruled their own empires and kingdoms were now seen through the lens of colonial racism, their histories and cultures dismissed as inferior to those of their European conquerors. The legacy of slavery, which had already ravaged the continent, was perpetuated and deepened by the transatlantic slave trade, as European nations became the primary drivers of the systematic kidnapping, trafficking, and exploitation of Africans. With the advent of colonial rule, the economic foundations of West Africa were fundamentally transformed. What had once been a region thriving with indigenous trade networks and flourishing cities was now subjected to the demands of European imperial interests. The colonial economy was based on the extraction of raw materials: gold, ivory, rubber, and most tragically, human lives. The once wealthy cities like Gao and Timbuktu, which had served as intellectual and cultural hubs, now became mere outposts of colonial administration, their indigenous leaders replaced with European governors and officials. The very essence of African civilization, once defined by vibrant kingdoms and empires, was now overshadowed by foreign occupation and exploitation. But even as the foreign powers sought to erase the legacy of Songhai and other African civilizations, the people of West Africa refused to be silenced. The resilience of the indigenous populations, their capacity to adapt and endure in the face of overwhelming adversity, would become a defining feature of the region's history. The stories of the great empires of the past, particularly Songhai, lived on in the oral traditions of the people, passed down from one generation to the next. These stories, though often suppressed or ignored by the colonial powers, carried the lessons of glory and tragedy, pride and fall, reminding the African people of their once great heritage. The collapse of Songhai and the rise of European colonialism also marked a period of profound social disruption. As the foreign invaders imposed their will upon the region, they introduced new forms of governance, laws, and social systems that were often in direct contradiction to the traditional ways of life that had long existed in West Africa. The societal structures that had allowed for the flourishing of empires like Songhai were undermined, and new systems of exploitation, such as the plantation economies and forced labor, took root in the colonies. The people of West Africa, many of whom had once been free citizens, were now subjected to systems of control that denied them basic human rights and dignity. Yet, in the face of these dark days, West Africa's enduring spirit could not be extinguished. The memory of Songhai, along with other great empires like Mali and Ghana, became a source of inspiration for those who resisted colonial rule. The struggle for independence that would later sweep across Africa was fueled by the desire to reclaim what had been lost, to restore the sovereignty and dignity of the African people, and to dismantle the structures of oppression that had been imposed by foreign powers. The legacy of Songhai, far from being forgotten, became a rallying cry for generations of Africans who fought for their freedom and independence. As the colonial powers retreated in the mid-20th century and African nations began to gain independence, the memory of the great empires of the past was resurrected. In the new nations of Africa, leaders and scholars sought to reclaim and preserve the rich cultural heritage that had been silenced during the colonial period. The stories of Songhai, Timbuktu, and the other great kingdoms of West Africa were once again told, not as relics of a distant past, but as vital parts of a living, breathing history that continued to shape the continent. The impact of foreign intervention in West Africa, though deeply tragic, ultimately gave rise to a new sense of African identity and pride. The forces of colonization, while destructive, could not erase the resilience and strength of the African people. The legacy of the Songhai Empire, though marked by conquest and decline, became a symbol of endurance, reminding the people of West Africa and the world that their history, though threatened by external forces, could never be completely extinguished. As we look back on the rise and fall of the Songhai Empire and the subsequent intervention of foreign empires, we are reminded that history is never truly finished. The story of Songhai, like all great civilizations, is part of a larger, ever-evolving narrative, a narrative that continues to shape the present and future of Africa. The people of West Africa, and indeed all Africans, continue to carry the lessons of their past with them, ensuring that the legacies of their great empires are never forgotten, but instead serve as a foundation for the continued struggle for justice, equality, and sovereignty. The enduring spirit of Songhai and the memory of its glory and tragedy will continue to resonate in the hearts of those who seek to honor the past while forging a new future. It is a legacy that transcends the boundaries of time and empire, one that remains etched in the soul of Africa itself. From the ashes of empire, the seeds of a new Africa were sown, and the spirit of Songhai will live on in the triumphs and struggles of those who rise to carry the torch of freedom and justice into the future. In the fading light of history, the Songhai Empire, once a towering monument of power, knowledge, and culture, has long since crumbled into the sands of time. Yet, even as its majestic cities fell to dust and its armies were scattered to the winds, the legacy of Songhai endured. A silent whisper across the vast expanse of West Africa, carried through generations, embedded in the very soil, in the songs and stories of its people. The cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne, once the beating hearts of the empire, stand as enduring symbols of Songhai's intellectual and cultural triumph. Timbuktu, with its grand libraries and flourishing schools, was a beacon of knowledge, an oasis of learning that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Here, under the shadow of towering minarets, the scholars debated, scribed, and preserved ancient wisdom, safeguarding the knowledge of centuries for future generations. These libraries, filled with manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law, became the lifeblood of intellectual exchange. Songhai had nurtured a civilization where minds could think freely and ideas could flourish, transcending borders and time. It was a city where ink, not blood, wrote history. But the decline of Songhai left these jewels exposed to the ravages of time, war, and foreign invasion. The Moroccan conquest and later the European colonization shattered this once thriving intellectual nexus, dispersing the wealth of knowledge and cultural achievement that Songhai had so carefully guarded. The libraries were looted, their priceless manuscripts burned or lost. Yet, the spirit of learning, the essence of intellectual curiosity, did not fade. It was passed on through the hearts of those who had been touched by the wisdom of Songhai's golden age. As the empire fell, so too did the vision of a unified West Africa, one where knowledge, trade, and power converged. The historical significance of Songhai's empire was lost to the world for a time, submerged beneath the weight of imperial expansion. Yet its echoes continued to resonate across the continent, influencing not only the future of West Africa, but also the broader narrative of African identity and culture. The fragmented remnants of Songhai, scattered across the African landscape, became symbols of resilience, enduring against the relentless tide of colonization and exploitation that would soon sweep across the continent. In the aftermath of Songhai's collapse, the landscape of West Africa shifted. The coming of foreign powers, first the Moroccans and later the European colonialists, forever altered the course of the region's history. The scramble for control over the trade routes, resources, and labor of Africa set the stage for centuries of exploitation. Songhai's rich gold mines, salt deposits, and trade routes became prizes for foreign invaders, setting in motion a period of colonial subjugation that would dismantle the political and social systems that had taken centuries to build. The legacy of Songhai's fall is inseparable from the larger story of African colonialism. With the rise of European powers, particularly Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain, the entire region was carved up, with artificial borders drawn by imperial forces. The exploitation of West Africa's resources, both human and natural, intensified as the transatlantic slave trade grew, feeding the coffers of European empires while leaving Africa decimated, its people scattered, enslaved, and oppressed. The very systems of trade and economy that had once given Songhai its power, gold, salt, and slaves, were now manipulated by foreign empires to fuel the global economy, perpetuating cycles of exploitation that lasted far beyond the fall of Songhai. Yet, even in this dark period of colonization, the legacy of Songhai continued to burn in the hearts of its people. The spirit of independence, of pride in African culture, and the memory of a once great civilization endured through the centuries of struggle. The resistance against colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries, from the Sahel to the heart of West Africa, was a direct continuation of the Songhai resistance. For in the memories of those who were born under foreign rule, there lived the echo of their ancestors' greatness, of an empire that had once stood tall against the tides of history. The fall of Songhai did not mark the end of its legacy. It was, in many ways, the beginning of a new chapter. The cultural contributions of Songhai, from its art and architecture to its intellectual and spiritual achievements, left an indelible mark on the region. In the rhythms of West African music, the intricate designs of its textiles, the deep wisdom embedded in its proverbs, and the enduring strength of its communities, the echoes of Songhai could still be heard. Its fall was not the death of its culture, but the metamorphosis of that culture into something resilient, ever-present, and transformative. In the modern era, the legacy of Songhai continues to be reclaimed by scholars, activists, and citizens of West Africa. Efforts to restore and preserve the lost knowledge of Timbuktu, to revive the historical memory of Gao and Jenne, are part of a larger movement to reassert African identity and dignity in the face of centuries of colonization and oppression. These efforts are not just about preserving the past, but about drawing strength from it to shape a future that honors the achievements of civilizations like Songhai. Yet, the story of Songhai is not solely one of loss. It is also a story of endurance, of the long arc of African history that bends toward reclaiming and preserving cultural heritage, of the determination of generations to rise above the ashes of empires and build anew. The resilience of the people of Songhai is evident in the ongoing struggles for independence, for justice, and for cultural revitalization across Africa today. The fall of Songhai was not the end of its story. It was simply a chapter in the long, ongoing narrative of Africa's past, its challenges, and its triumphs. Its legacy, preserved in the ruins of its cities and the resilience of its people, continues to inspire not just Africans, but the world. The empire may have fallen, but its spirit endures. In the pages of history, in the hearts of its descendants, and in the memory of all who seek to understand the soul of Africa. For Songhai, like all great civilizations, reminds us that even in the face of destruction, the essence of a culture, its wisdom, and its achievements can transcend the ravages of time, remaining forever etched in the collective consciousness of humanity. As the centuries have passed since the fall of the Songhai Empire, its legacy continues to reverberate through the veins of West Africa. While the political power of Songhai was extinguished by the forces of external invaders and internal decay, the cultural, intellectual, and social imprint of the empire still shapes the region today. What remains in the shadows of history are not just the ruins of cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne, but also the undying spirit of a civilization that once dominated the vast expanse of West Africa. Songhai's influence persists in the cultural landscape of the region, with elements of its traditions, language, and customs embedded in the very fabric of West African identity. It is in the dance, the music, the stories, passed down through generations, a quiet testament to the resilience of a people who continue to remember their roots even when the world around them seeks to erase them. For those who carry the heritage of Songhai, the echoes of their forebears' greatness are never truly gone. They remain woven into the collective consciousness of West Africa. In the present day, the cities that once flourished under Songhai's rule have been ravaged by time and the forces of history. Timbuktu, once the intellectual heart of West Africa and the Muslim world, continues to be a symbol of what was lost. Its ancient manuscripts, some of the last remnants of Songhai's great intellectual tradition, are now scattered, held in private collections, or locked away in institutions, while others were lost to war, fire, and neglect. Yet, despite these hardships, efforts to preserve the city's rich scholarly heritage persist. The libraries that once held the keys to knowledge, where scholars from across the globe came to learn, still inspire modern-day movements dedicated to reclaiming Africa's intellectual history. Timbuktu is not merely a place, it is an idea, a powerful symbol of the strength of human intellect and the capacity for civilizations to contribute to the broader story of humanity. The collapse of the Songhai Empire opened the door to the forces of European colonialism, which sought to reshape the political and economic landscape of Africa. But even as the European powers made their claims to the land, Songhai's legacy remained a quiet but powerful force. The colonial powers, especially the French, British, and Portuguese, sought to exploit Africa's resources, including the valuable lands once controlled by Songhai. They built their empires atop the rubble of Songhai and other African empires, restructuring the political systems, carving new borders, and imposing colonial institutions that disregarded centuries of local governance and social order. Yet, they could not entirely erase the deep cultural and historical roots of Songhai from the collective memory of West Africa. The legacy of the empire extended far beyond its intellectual contributions. Songhai's trade networks, which had once spanned across the Sahara, reaching from West Africa to the Mediterranean, and even into the heart of Europe and the Middle East, left behind a complex web of relationships that still echo today. The routes that carried gold, salt, and slaves during Songhai's heyday are now remembered not only for the wealth they generated, but also for the human cost they exacted. The legacy of this trade continues to shape the region, as many of the same routes, although now disrupted by political boundaries and national interests, are still used for trade and cultural exchange. Moreover, the social fabric of Songhai, with its complex caste systems and the intermingling of different cultures and peoples, has left a profound impact on the societies of modern-day Mali, Niger, and surrounding countries. The Songhai Empire was home to a diverse population that included ethnic groups such as the Songhai, Fulani, Tuareg, and many others. These people lived side by side, trading, intermarrying, and sharing customs and traditions that have continued to shape the social structure of the region. The interconnections between these various groups created a rich tapestry of cultural practices, languages, and beliefs that are still reflected in the diverse societies of the Sahel and Saharan regions. The political structure of Songhai, with its complex system of governance, also left behind a legacy of leadership that continues to influence West Africa today. The empire was ruled by a series of powerful emperors, or Askia, who held absolute power, but also had to navigate a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and internal divisions. The political systems that evolved within Songhai were deeply rooted in Islam, which was adopted by the ruling elite and woven into the very fabric of the empire. The legacy of Islam, which was embraced by Songhai's rulers, continues to be a defining feature of the region. The faith, with its emphasis on knowledge, learning, and community, has been a constant thread through West African history, connecting Songhai with other great Islamic civilizations and influencing the political and social development of the region long after the empire's fall. Despite the collapse of Songhai and the subsequent rise of colonialism, the traditions and customs that emerged from the empire have survived, morphing and adapting over the centuries, but never fading completely. The music of Songhai, with its deep roots in the traditional rhythms of the region, is still heard today in the beats of the djembe, the balafon, and the kora, instruments that have transcended time and geography to become symbols of African unity. The art and architecture of Songhai, with its distinctive adobe structures and intricate designs, have left a lasting imprint on the buildings and monuments of modern-day Mali and beyond. The oral traditions that flourished under the empire, the stories of kings, warriors, and scholars, continue to be passed down through generations, shaping the identities of those who claim the legacy of Songhai as their own. Yet, the most enduring legacy of Songhai may be its profound influence on the idea of empire itself. The rise and fall of Songhai, like that of all great civilizations, serves as a powerful reminder of the cyclical nature of history, that all empires, no matter how great, will eventually succumb to the forces of time, corruption, and external threats. The story of Songhai offers both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It reminds us that power and wealth, while important, are fleeting, and that the true strength of a civilization lies in its people, its knowledge, and its ability to adapt to the challenges of an ever-changing world. The fall of Songhai also planted the seeds for future African resistance. Even in the wake of its collapse, the legacy of the empire inspired leaders and movements that would fight for the independence of African nations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The memory of Songhai's glory became a rallying point for those seeking to free Africa from the chains of colonialism. The spirit of independence, self-determination, and pride in African heritage that was forged in the fires of Songhai's rise continued to burn in the hearts of African revolutionaries. In the modern era, the cultural, intellectual, and social legacy of Songhai continues to inspire efforts for African renewal. Across West Africa, scholars, artists, and cultural leaders are working tirelessly to recover and preserve the traditions and knowledge that were so central to Songhai's greatness. The restoration of Timbuktu's ancient libraries and the reclamation of Songhai's historical narrative are just a few examples of how the empire's legacy is being reintegrated into the fabric of modern African identity. The story of Songhai is not simply a chapter in the past, but a living, breathing legacy that continues to shape the present and the future of West Africa. It is a reminder that the struggles of the past, the triumphs and tragedies, the rise and fall of empires, are not forgotten. They are carried forward, woven into the collective memory of the people who inherit them. For even as the empire fell, its soul lived on in the hearts of its descendants, in the stories they tell, and in the cultural expressions that continue to echo across the lands that were once Songhai. The legacy of Songhai, like all great civilizations, will never truly be lost. It will endure, whispering its lessons and triumphs into the winds of time, forever shaping the identity of West Africa and the broader African continent.